All right, so months after the release of FF7 Rebirth, and the vast majority of mainstream gamers having certainly gotten to the end of the game by this point, it's my time to shine, baby. Okay, but seriously though, we have 3+ years until the final part in this FF Remake series comes out, so we have a long time to talk about this game, dissect it, talk about it, analyze it. And yes, you read that title right. This is my first impression from only 170 hours, and I have the screen grab to prove it. Okay, so the reason why I'm calling it my first impressions video is because I have this video format called Combat Comprehensive, where I talk about games in sort of a more definitive way. But the more that I've played FF7 Rebirth, the more I kind of realized I'm like, it's definitely gonna take a while, but I wanted to talk about the game right now, like in sort of like the early stages of me sort of learning about it. I feel like this should be obvious, but just a warning anyways. This will contain spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so get out now. I don't know how I could talk about the combat stuff without talking about story spoilers. Now, I haven't done everything quite yet. I don't have all of the Genji equipment. I haven't done all of the mini games or anything to unlock all the dark matter, to unlock every single craftable thing in the game quite yet. I did do the Gilgamesh stuff, and most of the combat challenges I have done, I'm really just stuck on like these 6-person bouts in Gold Saucer, in addition to Rulers of the Outer World in VR, surprise, surprise. Now this video is gonna be a little bit more loose and a bit more relaxed than my hour-and-a-half video on FF7 Remake. I do have like a script and plenty of notes about things I wanted to talk about here. If I could sum up this game's combat in sort of one idea, it's that it manages to take all of your wildest dreams and sort of transforms them into a machine precision-tuned combat system. They somehow manage to take these cool idea of team-up attacks, which totally running your imagination when maybe you're playing the original FF7 and you're playing Remake, and they manage to make it work. But not just work, but also critical and important to the overall flow of combat. There's just so many different cool things that you can do with the combat system that some people might have imagined and are so happy to see fully realized in this game. Okay, so the first thing that I noticed about playing 7 Rebirth is that it is kind of a scary bottomless pit to look down into. Early on in my playtime, I knew that there were systems that I didn't quite understand yet, but I trusted the game to sort of teach me about them and just sort of figure it out at some point. And many hours later, I do understand the basic systems and kind of what every character does, but the more I play, the more I kind of realize I know less than I think I do. I'm genuinely concerned that if I played through this game like about 4 or 4.5 times like I did Remake, that I still wouldn't fully understand the combat system at all. In fact, this game has so much potential that I even feel like at 60 FPS that I'm being held back a little bit in my full ability to play this game. Now, whether that be due to me needing that 120 FPS and that 8.3 milliseconds to fully utilize what the entire game is capable of, or that's due to the PS5 just constantly frame dropping in performance mode in these VR battles, I can't exactly quite tell yet, but I'm really interested in playing the PC version when it comes out, and that surely should have the option for 120 FPS in there. In fact, performance overall is just one of my few complaints about 7 Rebirth as a product. That it feels very weird that a game that goes beyond what I would expect from a sequel to do mechanically, but yet it feels like we're kind of backsliding a bit in terms of like overall like quality of presentation. 7 Integrated looked really amazing and arguably felt like a PlayStation 5 game in and of itself because of how good it looked. But now that we get to Rebirth, an actual game design for the PlayStation 5, I feel like the quality has dropped. It's actually kind of incredible how receptive to feedback the development team has been with Rebirth, because every single gameplay complaint that I had with 7 Remake has been like completely addressed in Rebirth. It's just a lot of stuff I complained about, like, oh, the teammate AI is not particularly good. The game addresses it by giving you materia that allows you to very precisely control what actions that your party members can do, like what specific abilities that they can use. Aerial combat. Aerial combat is another area where it's been so vastly improved that the characters that sucked at aerial combat before, Cloud and Tifa, got such big improvements on how aerial combat was implemented that I sometimes just naturally incorporate aerial combos into my play style and don't even realize I'm in the air sometimes. Especially with Cloud, it's very easy to get him into the air and not even realize it sometimes. Even some of the stuff that I didn't think that they would address, like the ATB cost of Ray of Judgment. They lowered the ATB cost to actually encourage you to use it in battle. Now at this stage of playing Rebirth, I'm about pretty proficient with about half of the 9 playable characters that I feel like I can get pretty close to tapping out their full maximum potential and understanding what each element of their toolkit can do in their overall play style. Cloud, Barrett, Zack, Sephiroth, and Cait Sith are really the 5 major characters that I feel like I got a pretty good grip on and I can use pretty well. The rest of the characters, really maybe not as much. 2 characters in particular I feel kind of bad about not really using to their full potential. Tifa and Aerith, I just kind of play them like their remake versions. Their sort of core gameplay style of just really strong magic caster and stagger percentage increase is just way, way too strong. And the game's really not forced me to consider some of these other options as well. So I'm really having to actively force myself into learning some of these other things. Yuffie, I feel pretty good about. I mean, she plays very, very similar to herself in Intermission. There's a couple new things with her and stuff that really opens up some insane possibilities with the certain ward setups and materia setups, etc., etc. But in general, I feel pretty comfortable with Yuffie, although I wouldn't say that she is my most proficient character quite yet. I really haven't tapped into her for her full potential as an ATB battery like a lot of other people have. And poor Red 13, man. I was so excited going into Rebirth to play as Red 13 because he was there at the end of Remake, he wasn't playable, but I just don't think I get the gist of this character. It's so weird. I completed his combat trial, the hardest thing you could do with solo Red 13 in the entire game, and I still don't feel like I kind of understand the gist of his character. I know he's a defensive-based character, and a lot of his moves are based around sort of buffing, your other party members and stuff, but I don't really feel like I kind of have a rhythm down with him, or exactly know what to do with him. Out of all of the characters that returned from Remake, I want to say that Barrett is probably my favorite of the returning characters, just because they really addressed a lot of the criticisms that people had about him being a tank, but him not really being anything other than reliable. He just didn't output damage, but in Rebirth, they just give him so much to change the game state. They make him such an incredible stagger machine by himself. Now, as for new characters in Rebirth, picking a favorite, it's kind of a hard decision. If I was forced to stick with characters that were in the main party, Cait Sith would definitely take the cake. He definitely is the most fun, interesting character. There's a lot of really interesting sort of wacky magic buff, debuff stuff that's all kind of tied in a Cait Sith's toolkit that it just seems all kind of random and odd and out of place. It seems like a giant hodgepodge pile of stuff. But once you kind of figure out how everything works together, I really think his playstyle is just bar none. There's nothing else in the game quite like him. If Aerith represents sort of the more traditional sort of magic side of cast a big spell for really high damage, Cait Sith kind of represents everything else, the more wacky side of the magic. Stuff like status effects or summons, just everything else just crammed into one character, but it works. But if we're talking about potential or just how I like the way the character plays, outside of just pure amount of abilities, I really like Zack. And I really like the way that he feels. I really like sort of the interesting things that they do with his character that sort of parallel Cloud, but are totally different. I like the way his air combat works, but he's just really locked down and you can't really do that much with him. I feel like if he was able to be fully utilized in the game, you could equip him with any equipment you want, equip him with any materia, and he had just a couple more abilities. I think he would be like my favorite character in Rebirth. I would like main Zack. All right, I actually want to take a little bit of a tangent to talk about the bonus characters that we got in the game outside the main party, Sephiroth and Zack. They're both very interesting characters, not just because they're kind of siphoned into their own little corner, but they're also just interesting from an overall like design user experience standpoint. I definitely know some people were speculating that because Sephiroth is playable, that the end of Rebirth was just going to be absolutely insane, go completely off the rails, because, well, why would Square Enix make an entirely playable Sephiroth if he wasn't going to be playable later in the game? That you weren't going to control him, or he was going to switch sides or something like that. That didn't turn out to be true. So it actually turns out that Square Enix is just willing to dump millions and millions of dollars into solving problems that they ended up creating for themselves by making this FF7 Remake project into multiple games. That if you have Sephiroth in the tutorial mission but not playable, you're not teaching players how to like cooperate with like another party member in the first chapter, so obviously you gotta have him playable. I will say though that Zack as a playable character is one of the most unhinged video game things I think I've ever seen in my entire life. Just an absolute total failure of user experience. I mean, the first time you control him is at the very beginning of the game, like you would normally think, right? You don't get to properly control him again and get a tutorial of how his combat works until the final boss? Huh? And so really you don't get like a proper introduction or even understanding of Zack's deeper combat mechanics until like you go back, wrap around in hard mode, you do the final boss fight in hard mode, and then you go and do his VR challenge too. Trying to learn Zack's mechanics in his VR challenge is not just throwing somebody into the deep end of the pool when they don't know how to swim. It's the equivalent of somebody dropping you into the middle of the ocean like 1,000 miles away from any islands or human civilization. The one downside to these combat challenges with Sephiroth and Zack though is that it doesn't really feel like it leaves me wanting more. Like in my head analytically, I know that these characters have more potential, but once I completed the combat challenges with both, I just didn't really feel like inside I was emotionally motivated to be like, yeah, man, I want to see these guys in like the next game with more abilities and like stuff to do with them. I just kind of sat there and was like, yeah, I'm just kind of done. I'm actually a little bit surprised given how this game just loves throwing like these really hard combat challenges at you, that once you completed Zack and Sephiroth's combat challenge, there wasn't some super duper ultimate legendary bout where you had to use a party of Cloud, Sephiroth, and Zack all together. Okay, so in regards to spoilers, I definitely was staying away from spoilers for the story. In terms of gameplay stuff, I didn't really care as much about knowing all the new mechanics going in. I actually did play the demo like a week before, but I was very, very surprised with all of the new stuff that you can do in Rebirth, just all the different kinds of things and creative ways that they modify combat or mix things up and not get you entirely bored. In fact, when I got to Gilgamesh's Island, I was super excited to fight Gilgamesh. I'm like, let's go right now. I'm gonna take you on, Gilgamesh. And the game's like, well, hold on there, bud. You got like 3 more fights before you fight Gilgamesh. And when I saw the double summon fights, I'm like, oh, yeah, this changes everything. So it actually turns out so that the developer's solution for sort of escalating the end game difficulty for people like me who just grinded Remake for like years and years and years was to just look at the Bahamut fight from Remake, the back half, where you summon a free and you have to kill him and Bahamut at the same time. And it was like a really cool thing. And they just thought, well, what if we did that, but we did that and made them their own fights? I also really like the double party fights that you can have in Gold Saucer, that they're called these 6-person bouts. So you have to kind of create like a party of 3 and a party of 3, and you have to fight against 2 sets of different enemies. It just kind of forces you to kind of change gears a little bit and like understand how to play every character. And that kind of brings me to like combat arenas in general in this game and just some of the interesting choices that they made. Firstly, there's just so many combat arenas in this game. It's actually like probably overwhelming to the average person, because there's the Chadley VR stuff, there's Gold Saucer, there's the battle arena at the bottom of the well in Corel Prison. That's not even including the ones that are tied into side quest, like the VR battles in the Shinra Manor in Nibelheim. And that's also not including the Proto-Relic Gungaga quest for the Turk VR ones. I know a lot of people complain about fighting the summons in VR, and they're like, well, why don't we like fight the summons out in the world? And I think that is a fair and valid complaint, even if I'm not particularly myself bothered by only fighting them in VR. Unfortunately, that's a cake that's kind of already been baked. The world map design in Rebirth is so absolutely tightly integrated that it's not like they could just like patch it to where, oh, the summons will now spawn in the world and stuff. Like, they kind of need to make like new specific areas in these maps for summon fights to happen. Now, one thing that is particularly missing from the endgame challenges that I didn't even notice until I started writing for this video is that this game really doesn't have a true equivalent to the Top Secrets challenge from 7 Remake, where you go through and you fight all of like the hard mode versions of the summons individually round by round. Now, I know what you might be thinking, that the full might summons are the hard version of the summon fights, that they're at full strength and full HP and everything, and they're just not in individual rounds. But I'm here to tell you that you're objectively wrong, but rather is combat mechanics. Stuff like Titan immediately using Earth Aegis at the beginning of battle, or Kujata jumping into 2 elements simultaneously. The reason I actually want to fight the summons like this is a couple of reasons. The first primary reason is that I think the difficulty curve with endgame challenges is a little bit wacky as it currently exists. You go through all these brutal challenges, and like the first couple are like, you know, you have to kind of know what you're doing, and then you get to Hellions Intimate, and like the game just really starts like forcing you to learn every single thing and play perfectly. So having like just hard mode versions of the summons that you can fight all in a row would be sort of like that nice sweet spot where, okay, this is like sort of where the previous top tier of difficulty was from the last game, and you're now going to be entering into a new tier of difficulty here. And the second reason is that it would actually add a little bit of like challenge to the summon fights, because having multiple rounds means that you have to accommodate for all of these different summons. So you have to do your materia build differently. Whereas with individual summon fights, you can just adjust your materia for that particular fight. So say if you're fighting Phoenix, right? You can just go into a Phoenix fight with elemental materia maxed out, linked with fire, and you take 0 damage from Phoenix. And that's part of why 7 Remake made its ultimate base game challenge multiple rounds, because the next round you have to consider a different summon, the next round a different summon, next round a different summon. And that changed the way that you approach battles. In fact, the only way that you can fight the hard versions of summons in a single round format is by doing Zack or Sephiroth's combat challenges. You can't even do it with the full party. Why? I don't get this. One thing that got changed in Rebirth that you may or may not have noticed is alternate playstyles based on the weapon that you have. So Melee Barret and Nailbat Cloud are the main things I'm talking about from Remake here that do not carry over to Rebirth. But even then, it feels like a lot of Melee Barret like got kind of absorbed into the rest of the combat system. So it doesn't even necessarily feel like a lot of it's gone. The block, for example, the insane block that Melee Barret has, kind of got absorbed into everybody else's block with the perfect parry system. And some of the synergy skills that Barret can do are melee focused. The one major mechanic I haven't really incorporated into my gameplay naturally is like synergy skills. Those abilities that are team attacks that pop up when you're holding guard. There's like offensive ones and defensive ones. I don't want to say that these moves are bad or terrible just because I don't understand them quite yet. But I feel a little like perplexed by some of their purpose. Particularly the offensive ones, those seem like they take up way too much time to set up relative to like how much ACB that they give the characters involved it just doesn't really seem all that worth it to me. The defensive ones I understand a little bit more, having the value of just being able to teleport another character like right to you outside of synergy abilities. It's a bit unfortunate because you can go the entire game without using synergy skills, because I certainly went my entire normal mode playthrough without really using any synergy skills whatsoever. And the only time the game really skill checks you for synergy skills is the Bahamut Arisen Summon fight. But I feel like that's not a true skill check, just because you can kind of process of elimination, like figure out what's working or not against him. In fact, synergy skills are the one mechanic I can totally see getting totally like revamped and expanded in part 3. There's just like a lot of like design space that it doesn't really seem like these moves that seem really cool on the surface don't really explore. That there is potential there possibly in the next game for like a sort of tag in, tag out type system of like, hey, you can like equip different ones of these based on like what different combinations of party members are available to you, and that may give you certain effects or benefits and stuff like that. I love synergy abilities in this game so much. They are one of the most brilliant video game mechanics I think I've ever seen, and I'm not exaggerating. I cannot imagine how much effort really went into like properly balancing these things. I know that there was so much effort already put in, given how many unique animations there are for all the different synergy moves and everything, but just actually trying to like properly balance this system, because it's tied into the ATB system, and how much ATB that you get transfers into these attacks, and like, okay, how do we make all of these moves like not super powerful while accounting for like everything else in the game? It seems so like mind-numbingly complex in order to balance. Synergy abilities definitely have a very specific role in the combat system, given that they give you buffs, and they definitely set a lot of the pacing for the fights. That your average 7 Rebirth fight is very much dictated by the pacing of when you can achieve synergy abilities and stuff, and really your continued momentum is based on like, hey, have you used up all of your synergy abilities yet or not? And so I really like that it is not just like something cool that you can engage with that gives you buffs, but also it kind of changes the tempo of combat. And you really sort of have to rethink the way that you fight like certain enemies and stuff. It's like, okay, I need to kind of switch characters and stuff so I can kind of even out my ATB usage, so I can use this attack to get this buff to start casting tons of magic against this enemy here. But I also really appreciate how the developers like infringe on the design space of synergy abilities a little bit in order to sort of open up sort of the build freedom of the game. That there's Corsair's Compass, which lets you get 3 ATB bars if you use, I think that's like 5 different abilities, or that one piece of equipment that lets you start with like a max limit level at the start of battle. I thought those were actually pretty cool, that if you didn't have a particularly optimal team combination where like you could get those limit level increases or the ATB buffs, that hey, you can use these pieces of equipment instead. Synergy abilities also show a lot of what this remake series does really well, which is like character interaction stuff. It definitely feels like the developers really thought about like, hey, what are some really cool interactions that different combinations of characters have with like their personalities and their different play styles? Like, what sort of cool little moves in this specific format can we do? And that's how you kind of end up with all this cool stuff, like Cloud kind of sitting on top of the Moogle with Cait Sith, or Barrett just using his gun arm like with Cait Sith, or like Yuffie and Tifa doing a Kamen Rider kick. I'd say my favorite synergy ability buff is the free MP one. That's just absolutely insane that the game can just give you free MP for even a limited amount of time, and it's still somehow balanced. That the game's like, okay, just cast all your spells for free, buddy. Is it gonna matter if you have 0 MP cost if you're dead? Now, when I initially started messing with this mechanic, I thought that this was some sort of trick, that there was like some sort of catch to the free MP. I was thinking maybe that the game checks if you have the requisite MP first, to even cast the spell and then just bypasses the cost for you. So that way it disincentivizes sort of reckless MP usage in hard mode. Because I could easily see something like that happening, where you just blow all of your MP and then you use your free MP and just keep casting magic. But no, it is literally free. You can have 0 MP and still cast like all of these crazy 30 MP spells. Magic is another area in this game I really don't feel like I've properly explored. I've mostly just been kind of using the remake method of just hit things really hard with the most powerful elemental spell possible, and not really digging that much into some of the crazier setups that you could possibly do. I will say that the biggest thing that I learned regarding Magic is that status effects are your best friend. I mean, obviously, Odin, you have to use status effects on, but even just normal enemies, go wild with the status effects, man. Because it wasn't really until Hellions Intimate I really understood like where the full suite of status effects could do. Yeah, I could use Stop from the Time Materia. I was pretty familiar with that. Really, it wasn't until like you had to fight like White Terror plus like the big slime at the same time where I'm like, oh yeah, I can't fight 2 of these enemies at the same time because I'm gonna get killed pretty bad. And so you really have to learn, like, hey, sleep is pretty good. Sleep, if it works on an enemy, it stops them from attacking so you can deal with another enemy at the same time. The most interesting change I noticed right away playing the game was that the elemental, like, Aga spells, Firaga, Blizzaga, etc., those had their APTB costs increased from 1 to 2. I actually think this is like a very, very good change. Magic was pretty abusable in Remake. You could just sit and just cast. Especially if you had Refocus, you could just like cast like these ultra powerful spells 3 times in a row. Increasing their cost to 2 ATB doesn't make them any less powerful, it just makes them less abusable, if that makes any sense. Swift cast materia now makes the bottleneck how much ATB you have, which also makes the ATB cost increase on the Aga spells really, really important because now that's your bottleneck. Of course, there's just so much new blue materia related to just spell casting in general. Things that increase the potency and the duration, reduce your MP cost, how quickly you can cast something, which is always like a giant bottleneck like in Remake, just how long it takes to cast something. And now you can just totally negate it with the blue materia. Now, as great as all the new materia are and everything, there's been this kind of weird sort of design trend with the materia I kind of picked up on after having played through the game. Maybe other people have talked about it. And it's kind of just the game walking sort of like this weird fine line with materia and how stingy it kind of is with certain materia. With certain materia, you could just get like so many copies of it, it's ridiculous. Like, I think there's like 7 or 8 different level boost materia that you can acquire in the entire game. You could like acquire a lot of HP up materia, etc, etc. But then like other particular materia are particularly stingy with. It kind of seems to me like the developers are walking this very fine line of like wanting to have players equipped like with their full party to have like 2 teams at once in certain points of the story, not wanting to give certain materia out, because if you have multiple copies that you can spread across multiple parties, that also means you can have multiple copies of the same materia in the same party, and that could break something. And it really seems like the developers don't really want to commit to like putting hard restrictions on having multiple copies of the same materia on like the same character or within the same party in the same way that like the boosts are, right? Where you see these descriptors that say, oh, you can only boost up this stat by so much if you have multiple of this materia equipped. It doesn't really seem like they want to like commit to a similar type of restriction, whether that due to it being too complicated for maybe like a short little text bubble for the player to understand, or just to make like the overall programming or design like simpler or something. I also can't believe that Rebirth does not let you have any sort of material loadout presets that you could save. It blows my mind, man. It already was pretty suspect and unacceptable for Remake to not have this feature back in 2020 as a PlayStation 4 game. And then we get to Rebirth 4 years later where the materia setups are so much more complicated. You have way more characters that you have to manage. There's more materia slots, and like combat scenarios are just so much more complicated. And it still doesn't have this feature. In fact, the lack of loadouts, I think, is really starting to hurt this combat system. That if somebody wants to really get into this combat system and just sort of learn and experiment with things, then they can't just like save something and then like experiment and try something else. So they have to manually go through and remember like what previous materia setup that they have. It just makes the experience of like learning the game system just so unapproachable and annoying. I want to sort of talk about like the power creep and sort of the level of challenge over Rebirth, because I actually think that it's really well done. I think for the average player, Rebirth does a really good job at simultaneously like introducing all of these mechanics and stuff, but not really like kind of forcing it onto people, just being like, hey, you know, if you want to mess with this stuff, here it is, go ahead. And I feel like even by the end of Rebirth, the game really does start challenging the average player on mechanics that already existed in remakes, stuff like the stagger system, because it feels like by chapter 14, or even as early as the Temple of the Ancients, the game really starts to skill check. Hey, do you know how to like stagger things? Because you're gonna have to start staggering some of these enemies to really like chip them down and stuff. I never really saw like any other points in like Remake or Rebirth's normal mode where I really felt like I needed to stagger something, but by the end of Rebirth, I definitely did. Going into Rebirth, I was wondering how, with the stagger system just kind of being a known quantity at this point, how they really try to like escalate the power level, because, well, the stagger system just absolutely destroys any enemy once you knock it down. Like, how can you create a compelling like boss fight with all of these new powerful tools without it just being super duper annoying to get to the point of stagger? But I feel like the developers did a really good job at making enemies and bosses just so much more complicated and have so much more things that you have to deal with, that the stagger system is still there and it is still important, but it's an overall smaller fraction of the stuff that you have to manage. But anyways, yeah, that's just kind of everything I feel about the game right now in a nutshell, which feels really weird to say about a video this long. Rebirth is such an incredible and fantastic game, and it just has so much depth to it. And I really do feel like that it is a game that you can come back to and play for years. And I know people say that a lot about action games. It's like, well, this game is so good that people will keep playing it years later. Well, what they usually mean is that like the game still holds up and there will be like a steady new player base coming in of people trying to play it. But Rebirth, I genuinely feel that not only is it going to keep like a steady new amount of people coming in years and years and years later, but I think that you could keep playing this game on a semi-regular basis until the next 7 Remake game comes out, and you will not get bored. Maybe not playing it like all day, every day. You'll probably get bored of it by doing that, but like, if you play the game for like, I don't know, like once or twice a week, you try to do some fun setup, you try to learn some interesting thing, you try to figure out some quirky thing with the combat, I really think you can actually get a lot of mileage out of this game. But yeah, definitely I'm gonna keep doing more videos on 7 Rebirth, even outside of the combat system. I want to talk about the story about the game at some point, maybe something about the presentation, maybe even use this game as sort of a prism to view sort of the rest of the video game industry in 2024 through, because it really feels like this game has so many different facets to it, and there's so much interesting stuff going on, that I feel like I could keep talking about it for a while in a long video format like this, and it wouldn't really get boring. But anyways, guys, that's it for the video. If you like this video, hit like. If you want to see more FF7 Rebirth videos, potentially going even deeper into the game, hit subscribe. If you liked this video a lot, you want to help me, give me some resources to make more content like this, hit up the Patreon down in my description and give me some of that cash money. Incentivize me a little bit. That's it for the video, and have a good day.